You touched a little bit on the northern border and the green light law. Back in September, you were speaking out about repealing, if not the whole law, at least the part of the law that doesn't allow law enforcement to communicate together and to share information. The numbers obviously have dramatically jumped in the past couple of years, dropped off a bit in recent months. The overwhelming majority of migrants seem to be passing through the North Country and heading to other parts. If you're elected to Congress, how do you tackle that? Do you go back and look at some of the bipartisan bills that have been put out there and try to find something that works, that deals with the issue of cutting down on the number of migrants coming across the border?
So the Swanton sector of our northern border, New Hampshire to Watertown, by far has the most illegal crossings. In fact, I think the last year's data that I saw, if you added up all the rest of the Canadian border, we still had more illegal crossings in Swanton sector. They're not going through New Hampshire or Vermont. They're coming through northern New York. Why? Because it's a land crossing and you have the proximity of major metropolitan areas in Canada with international airports. So you've got Ottawa, you've got Toronto, and you've got Montreal. And so our border crossing problem with Canadians isn't Canadians that are coming across, it's people from other countries that are flying to Canada. So the point of pointing that out is that they have a choke point, the airports. They have a much easier, this isn't caravans that are starting somewhere in South America and wandering through, Central America, picking up people along the way until they get to the Rio Grande. These are people that are flying here, so they have passports, they have documentation, but on the Canadian side, they've been allowed to into the country there, and then they're crossing illegally. So what can be done? Well, first of all, and I got some media questions about this right away, again, because I'm a state legislator and because my district abuts Canada, so that's why they're calling me and not somebody else. But they asked me about Trump's tariffs, and they're like, well, President Trump's talking about, well, he's not talking about dropping tariffs just because he wants to kick around Justin Trudeau. He's talking about tariffs for Mexico and Canada, and their out is, if you fix your share of the border issue, then you won't have the tariffs. So he's given them the fair warning, he's using leverage, and he's already getting a result. Canada is, and rightly so. It's too bad that it takes, nudging with a threat of a tariff to get action, but the Biden administration didn't do any of that. Because Trump had, 4 years in office before, and we know he's not afraid to use some leverage. When he says, I'm going to put a tariff on you, they know he's not kidding, he means business. But you want to avoid the tariff, and I'm glad, I'm happy to see the tariffs avoided because I understand the economic arguments. But he's saying, I will not do the tariff if you fix the border. And Canada, instead of saying, no, we're going to fight you and we'll take the tariffs, they're doing what I think is the smarter play, but more importantly, the right play, and they're addressing the issues there. So, we'll see, what those numbers look like. But between that and, an actually empowered ICE and Border Patrol, running around, and I've had the pleasure and honor of meeting Tom Homan several times in my career because he's got a place in Jefferson County. I've seen him at various events around here over the years. He's going to get this job done. He's going to be empowered by President Trump to get it done. And Tom Homan, like Donald Trump, he's got a lot of moxie. He's got a lot of determination and grit. He's a no-nonsense guy, and he's passionate about it. You can see in his eyes when you talk to him. He's going to get this job done. So, is there a bigger picture? I mean, the solution, do nothing because we need migrant workers to work agricultural jobs, which is the argument from the left. That's not the law. Again, I keep going back to, if you don't like the law, then fix the law. So, does Congress need to come up with its own fixes to the border issues? Absolutely, and I hope some energy is put into that. But in the meantime, Donald Trump did a lot with executive orders. Then Biden came in and undid them with executive orders. President Trump is going to come in and do his own thing with executive orders. But if we want to fix this permanently going forward, legislation is going to be required. And time to do that is the next 2 years.
Canada has proposed that $1 billion plan. Do you think that will help address the issue?
I always get asked about the state's $239 billion budget. I vote against it. I complain about it. And people say, is there anything good in the budget? There better be a lot of good stuff. And if you're spending $239 billion, how can there not be? So if Canada is spending $1 billion to fix this, I'm sure that it will have impact. I hope that they're efficient in their decision making and their spending. I'd like to see them get max bang for their buck. But I mean, I don't have a feel for the numbers. Is $1 billion the right number? Is $5 billion the right number? Right now, no one in Washington is pushing Canada to do anything. So right now they're spending nothing, no energy and no money on it. And we've had record crossings on the northern border. So I like to think that, again, the incoming U.S. administration with conviction and credibility telling Canada, fix this or there's going to be financial consequences. I think Canada's going to do their best. So I think that $1 billion is probably going to help.
Are you hearing from people, though, worried that the impact tariffs could have on trade between Quebec and New York in particular, our biggest trading partner?
Well, look, certainly there's close relationships and no one wants to see them damaged or even interrupted, or inconvenienced. That there's a lot of commerce across both sides of this stretch of the border. Gary Douglas and the North Country Chamber of Commerce have famously advocated and done a fantastic job at fostering that relationship between the U.S. and Canada. I mean, the Canadian officials that I've met over the years have been largely through the North Country Chamber. So they're concerned, but the reality is that this is a much bigger problem than just the Plattsburgh area, just the Clinton County area that needs addressing. And again, I haven't had anyone say, oh, well, you shouldn't use that as a tool to get action. I mean, the bottom line is I think he's getting results because he put it on the table. So that's using leverage effectively.
A huge concern right now is the upcoming closure. Let me rephrase that by the time this airs. Also a huge concern right now is just within the past few days, the closure of dozens of border crossings along the northern border that began within this past week. Many smaller crossings closing down during evening and overnight hours. You've raised concerns about those proposed closures. You believe this is a mistake?
Yeah, I do. Well, first of all, I think that we've shortchanged the northern border as far as human resources for a while because we've got a crisis on the southern border. I do think that with executive action, that a lot of that will stop, and there'll be flexibility to move human resources around again. But if we need to make an additional investment on our Border Patrol to have staffing, then we should. But I was contacted by local officials that were concerned and pointing out that, hey, there are mutual aid emergency agreements, and there are members of various fire companies on the New York side that there's membership on the Canadian side, or that just I think a day after I wrote my letter to the governor pointing this all out, or actually I think it was the day before rather, because I think I included in my letter, there was a structure fire in Chateauguay, and a Canadian company crossed the border to respond to fight that fire. So these are the little things that maybe somebody in Washington D.C. that's looking at this, or a bean counter, they're not factoring in. I mean, this goes to, hey, maybe we should be expecting our departments to measure twice and cut once before you make an announcement like this. Let's go and see, well, what are the local impacts going to be? But in New York, that's one of the concerns. But you can't have a part-time border. I understand that you might have 1 or 2 cars crossing a night. We're not talking about a garrison of 50 people at these border crossings either. So I reject that. And I think it's weird that after 4 years of neglect, that the Biden administration wanted to all of a sudden at the last minute say, hey, we're going to go and take some action on the northern border. We're going to close down these, like it's going to stop anyone from crossing illegally, by the way. It's really only inconveniencing commerce and legitimate border crossing and emergency services.
Would this be a priority for you if elected to Congress to get these reopened 24 hours?
Well, absolutely. I mean, like I was asked in an earlier interview today about congestion pricing. Hey, that's a New York City issue. Why do you care? Well, look, as a member of the state legislature, we're talking about state resources, state entities, the state dollars. I'm supposed to care about the whole goings on in the state. Now, with that said, I have my own district to focus on, but that doesn't mean that you can't do both. And likewise, as a member of Congress, you have an obligation to your district. Those are the people that elected you. You represent them. You don't represent people in Oklahoma. But at the same time, you have a national interest, and national interests are also district interests. So, but for me specifically, because this involves this district, of course, that would be something that I would definitely advocate for. The nice thing is I think we'd have a receptive ears in the borders are, because Tom Holman, is from Northern New York, has a place in Jefferson County, so he knows these issues, and they're near and dear. They're close to him. Certainly, I think that we'd have a sympathetic ear in Washington.
For now, while all this plays out, you'll be heading back to Albany. The session getting underway this week. You'll be there for the State of the State coming up next week. She's released some of the legislative agenda that she plans to present to lawmakers. What are your thoughts on the inflation tax refund that would give up to $500 to back to families that make less than $300,000?
It is a political gimmickry. If you want to make an impact, then do it with a broad stroke. Don't do it with a targeted check to individual people with your name on it. That's politics. We should be above that. Let's look at the more holistically. Let's realize that we spend more than Texas and Florida combined, or that we spend 1.5 times per capita what California does. Let's look at paring down the budget, not saying, oh, well, we're going to just take, we're going to cut people $300, $500 checks. That's not going to have a lasting impact. It's certainly more of a, hey, look at me, I care about you, and it's a political game. I'd rather do something more meaningful, more permanent.
The governor is also going to propose a statewide ban on cell phones in schools. Many school districts have already taken steps on their own, but is a statewide policy a good idea?
The kids walk around in the phones. I know from my own personal experience, my shortcomings is that my over-attention to my cell phone. And so I just think in a teenager or a preteen, it's even worse. I got a 19-year-old, and I'm sure that it was a distraction for him in high school. Should it take state action to do this? This is the kind of thing that I think schools should be addressing on their own with their own policy. Do we need Big Brother to micromanage and tell individual school districts this is how to do this? Maybe if there's some schools that aren't addressing it or it's getting away. I'm not opposed to banning phones in classrooms by students. But that's something that we pay our school superintendents good money to run their schools, and we should put this is something that they all should be doing on their own.
What are you and your fellow Republicans? What are your priorities for the new year and the new session?
It's always first and foremost affordability. It's just the reality of the cost to live and do business in New York State. Now, that opens up a whole bunch of different pathways of where we're talking about that, but the $2.5 billion last year, $4.3 billion over the last 2 years of tax money to New York City for illegal immigrants. Maybe we should be looking at turning off that spigot. If you don't have a magnet telling people, come here and we'll give you free phones and free housing, and you can step over homeless veterans on your way into a 3-star hotel in New York City. Maybe if we did that $4.5 billion would go a long way, because we have a nursing home problem. And Medicaid reimbursement rates have not kept up over the last 20 years. I think it was the last 2 years that we finally saw upward movement in those rates, but basically for the previous 2 decades, they haven't moved at all. But the cost on all these facilities has gone up. Minimum wage has gone up. Staffing ratio mandates have been put into place. New York has been very good at dictating and increasing costs to nursing homes, but they haven't done anything to adjust the revenue side. And so what have we seen? We've seen a lot of nursing homes close. The last assisted living center in St. Lawrence County, the largest geographic county in the state, it closed its doors this past May. There's no assisted living centers in St. Lawrence County now. So what is the nursing home reimbursement rate price tag to fix that? They put a number of about $650 million to catch them up so their head would be above water again. That's a lot of money, but when you say, well, we just gave $4.5 billion to New York City for illegal immigrants, why don't we take 650 away from that 4.5 and do right by our seniors that have lived there their whole lives, paid their taxes, raised their family, followed the law, did everything that you would ask of a citizen, and now their only crime is that they're older and they need assistance, and we're telling them, gee, sorry, we don't have money to fix the nursing home situation. So there's that. Obviously the green light bill that you brought up, that is very relevant in my district, and that's something that I would like to see. It's one thing when a North Country Republican lawmaker, says, hey, this is a bad policy, and this isn't good for our borders. But you had a bipartisan group of sheriffs, and I'll throw, as the Democrat of the Ford group here, Sheriff Favreau here in Clinton County, and I know he wouldn't mind because it was his idea. It was a conversation that I had with Dave Favreau a few years ago about, hey, why don't we just repeal the green light law for border counties? Sheriff, wonderful idea. Put the bill in. A few years later, we're still trying to push this bill. Democrats won't let it go to vote, but all the sheriffs in the North Country say, yes, this is important. We'd like to have this. But it's not just North Country. It's a bipartisan group of lawmakers in the New York City Council, all 6 Republicans and 3 Democrats. They call themselves the Common Sense Caucus. They wrote a letter about the same time that I had that press conference back in the fall to the governor, asking her to use executive power to rein in some of the sanctuary city and state policies because they were concerned with migrant crime in New York City because it was in the news then. So this isn't just a North Country Republican issue. This is New York City lawmakers asking for more or less the same thing from the governor. Never did get a response from Governor Hochul on that. But since that letter, we've had a woman burned alive in the subway by an illegal immigrant. So the issue hasn't gotten any better, despite her tweet 7 hours later saying that she's doing a good job on safety in the subways.
The governor and state have just put congestion pricing into effect, charging motorists a fee if they head into the heart of New York City during peak hours. The aim is to cut down on gridlock and pollution. The money also to help fund the MTA and its $65 billion 5-year capital plan. You've been critical of charging motorists these fees to head into the heart of New York City. What is your thought on the fact that this plan's moving ahead?
Well, first of all,
and the state's going to be asked to kick in $33 billion.
It is a tax on the working class. It's a tax on the working person that has to travel into the city. There's no way around it. This is a tax. But furthermore, the governor hit the pause button because the governor and the Democrats realized heading into election that congestion pricing was a disaster politically for them in the Hudson Valley, on Long Island, and all these House races. So they panicked. Governor Hochul certainly got a phone call from somebody in Washington saying, you got to do something here. She hits the pause button, and then lo and behold, a couple weeks after the election, she hits the play button again, albeit with a slightly reduced dollar amount. But the bottom line is that congestion pricing is a tax on the working class, the working person. It's not good for our economy, and it's supposed to be earmarked for the MTA. I'm not sure. I've seen enough in Albany of the shell games with where money goes where I'm not convinced that that's true. But even if it was true, the MTA is one of the worst managed entities on the planet. It needs more scrutiny, not more money. And so I think before we start throwing more hard-earned tax money at them, there needs to be a serious recollection over how they're spending their money. They are not efficient with their money. It's a boondoggle.